There's something strange about humanity, something that shouldn't be possible if you understand how evolution and genetics work. Right now, there are about 8 billion humans on planet Earth. We're spread across every continent, living in radically different environments, speaking thousands of languages, practicing countless cultures. We look different from each other. Some of us are tall, some short. Different skin colors, different facial features, different body types. We seem incredibly diverse, but genetically we're not. We're eerily, impossibly similar. More similar than we have any right to be. Take chimpanzees. There are fewer than 300,000 chimpanzees left in the wild. A tiny population compared to humanity's 8 billion. And yet, those 300,000 chimps have significantly more genetic diversity than all 8 billion humans combined. The same is true for gorillas, for orangutans, for almost every other large mammal species on Earth. They have small populations, but high genetic diversity. We have an enormous population, but genetic diversity so low, it looks like we nearly went extinct in the recent past. Because we did. Sometime in our history, probably multiple times, the human population crashed so severely that we came within a hair's breadth of disappearing entirely. These events are called genetic bottlenecks, and they leave unmistakable signatures in DNA. They're like scars written into our genes, permanent records of times when almost everyone died, and only a handful survived. And when scientists started mapping the human genome, when they started comparing genetic sequences from populations around the world, they found evidence that made some of them physically uncomfortable. The data suggested that at one point there might have been as few as 2,000 breeding humans left on the entire planet. Some estimates go even lower, a few hundred breeding pairs, a population small enough that everyone alive today might be descended from a group that could have fit inside a few city blocks. This isn't speculation. This isn't ancient mythology. This is written in your DNA and mine. We are all descendants of an unimaginably small population that somehow, against ridiculous odds, managed to survive whatever killed almost everyone else. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you are right now and what time it is. I always check, and I love seeing the variety. London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, Sydney at breakfast. All of us scattered descendants of the same tiny ancestral population, all wondering about the same mysteries at different hours. Here's what makes genetic bottlenecks so fascinating and so terrifying. They're not hypothetical. We can prove they happened by looking at patterns in modern DNA. Every time a population crashes to a tiny number and then rebounds, it leaves specific fingerprints. Reduced genetic variation because, with fewer individuals, there are fewer unique genes in the gene pool. Increased genetic similarity between individuals because everyone ends up being more closely related. Specific mutations that spread through the entire population because, with so few individuals, random mutations have a much higher chance of becoming fixed in the population. Think of it like this. Imagine you have a bag of marbles with 100 different colors. That's your starting population with high genetic diversity. Now, randomly pull out just 5 marbles. That's your bottleneck. Even if those 5 marbles reproduce, and eventually you've got millions of marbles again, they'll only come in 5 colors. The other 95 colors are gone forever. That's what happened to us. Except, instead of marbles and colors, we're talking about humans and genes. The evidence for these bottlenecks shows up in multiple ways. Mitochondrial DNA, which passes down through the maternal line, shows that all humans can trace their ancestry back to a surprisingly recent common maternal ancestor. Y chromosome DNA, which passes down through the paternal line, shows the same pattern on the male side. Autosomal DNA, the chromosomes that come from both parents, shows similar patterns of reduced diversity. Every genetic system tells the same story. Humanity went through at least one, possibly several, events that reduced our population to catastrophically low numbers. But here's where it gets really interesting. We can use these genetic signatures to estimate when these bottlenecks happened, and the dates we get are recent. Terrifyingly recent in evolutionary terms. The most severe bottleneck appears to have occurred somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. Maybe around 70,000 years ago, give or take. That's not ancient history in geological terms. That's practically yesterday. Modern humans had already evolved. We had big brains, language, sophisticated tools. We were us, recognizably human, and we almost didn't make it. What could kill off 90% or more of the human population in a relatively short time? What could bring us that close to extinction? The answer might be written in volcanic ash layers found in sediment cores from around the world. About 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano in Sumatra called Mount Toba erupted. This wasn't just a big eruption. This was the biggest volcanic eruption in the last 2 million years. When Toba blew, it ejected something like 670 cubic miles of rock and ash into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, Mount St. Helens in 1980 ejected about a quarter of a cubic mile. Toba was roughly 2,500 times larger. The ash cloud spread across the entire planet. Deposits of Toba ash have been found in ice cores from Greenland, in lake sediments from East Africa, in ocean floor cores from the Indian Ocean. The eruption was so massive that its effects were global and immediate. Sunlight was blocked for years, maybe decades. Global temperatures plummeted. Some estimates suggest average temperatures dropped by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in some regions. Plants died, animals starved, ecosystems collapsed. This event is called the Toba catastrophe theory, and while scientists still debate exactly how severe its effects were, there's no question that it was devastating. The genetic evidence suggests human populations crashed hard around this time. The timeline matches almost perfectly. Toba erupts roughly 74,000 years ago. The genetic bottleneck shows up in DNA around 70,000 to 75,000 years ago. The archaeological record from this period shows a dramatic decline in artifact production, suggesting much smaller human populations. The fossil record becomes sparse, indicating fewer individuals were around to fossilize. Everything points to a near-extinction event triggered by volcanic winter. But here's what's really haunting about this. We have no written records from that time, obviously. No oral histories that go back 70,000 years. No cave paintings showing what happened, how people experienced it, how they survived. We only have the genetic evidence, the chemical signatures in ash layers, and mathematical models of climate effects. We're trying to reconstruct humanity's brush with extinction using indirect evidence, and the picture that emerges is terrifying. Imagine living through that. You're part of a small hunter-gatherer group, somewhere in Africa or Asia. You've got maybe 30 people in your band. You know a few other bands in the region, maybe a couple hundred people total within a few days' walk. Then one day, the sky starts darkening. Ash begins falling like snow. It doesn't stop. Days pass, weeks, the ash keeps falling, the sky stays dark. Temperatures drop, the plants start dying, the animals you hunt start disappearing, either migrating away or starving. Your children are hungry. There's less and less to eat. Winter comes, except it's not regular winter. It's colder than anything anyone has ever experienced, and it keeps getting colder. Years pass. The sky is still dark. Most of the game is gone. The fish populations have crashed because the rivers are clogged with ash. Plants that used to be abundant are now rare. Bands that you used to trade with have stopped showing up at the usual meeting places. You don't know if they've moved or if they're all dead. Your own group is smaller now. People have died from hunger, from cold, from diseases that take hold more easily in weakened bodies. You're down to maybe 15 people from your original 30. Everyone is related. Everyone knows everyone. You're all desperately clinging to survival, not knowing if conditions will ever improve. This isn't science fiction. This happened. We know it happened because we exist, because someone survived. Some small population held on through the volcanic winter, and eventually the ash settled. The sun came back, the temperatures recovered, plants returned, animal populations rebounded, and the survivors rebuilt. But there weren't many of them. Maybe a few thousand people globally, maybe less. Now, you might be thinking, wait, how can we be so sure about these population numbers? Couldn't there have been more people who just didn't leave genetic traces? Good question. The answer is no. Genetic diversity doesn't lie. When we sequence DNA from populations around the world, we can calculate what's called effective population size. This isn't the total number of people who might have been alive. It's the number of individuals who actually contributed genes to future generations. And every analysis, using multiple different methods, keeps coming back to the same startling conclusion. At some point in the past, the effective breeding population of humans was tiny, catastrophically tiny. Different studies give different numbers, and there's debate about the exact figures. Some suggest as few as 1,000 to 10,000 individuals globally. Some estimates go lower, a few hundred breeding pairs. But even the most generous estimates put the total breeding population at less than 20,000 at the bottleneck's most severe point. That's astonishingly small for a species that was already spread across large parts of Africa and possibly into Asia. To understand how small that is, consider this. Today, species with populations under 10,000 are considered endangered. Under 2,000, and they're critically endangered, at serious risk of extinction, even with human intervention and conservation efforts. We're talking about a population that, by modern standards, would have wildlife biologists extremely worried. And we had no intervention, no conservation programs, no one trying to save us, just tiny scattered bands of humans trying to survive in a world that had become suddenly hostile. The genetic evidence also tells us something else. These survivors weren't evenly distributed. The bottleneck didn't affect all human populations equally. Some areas got hit much harder than others. East Africa seems to have been one of the primary refugia, places where conditions remained tolerable enough for humans to survive. Some coastal regions where seafood remained available might have sheltered small populations. But vast regions that had previously supported human populations became uninhabitable, at least temporarily. This uneven survival created what geneticists call founder effects. When a population crashes and then expands again from a small number of survivors, the genetic characteristics of those specific survivors get amplified. Mutations that happen to be present in the founder population, even if they're neutral or slightly deleterious, spread through the entire descendant population. Beneficial traits that happen to be present in the survivors become ubiquitous. The genetic makeup of the entire future species gets determined by the random luck of which individuals happened to survive the bottleneck. Think about what that means for humanity. Every genetic trait that's common in humans today, it's common, partly because it was present in that tiny ancestral population that survived the bottleneck. Our susceptibility to certain diseases, our physical characteristics, our cognitive abilities, all of it was shaped not just by millions of years of evolution, but by the specific individuals who happened to make it through the catastrophe 70,000 years ago. Some researchers have argued that the bottleneck might have actually accelerated certain evolutionary changes. With such a small population, genetic drift becomes much more powerful. Random mutations can spread quickly. Beneficial adaptations that might have taken tens of thousands of years to spread through a large population could fix in just a few thousand years in a small population. The cognitive revolution that seems to appear in the archaeological record around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, the sudden appearance of art, sophisticated tools, symbolic thinking, might be connected to the bottleneck. Small population, intense survival pressure, rapid evolutionary change. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand exactly what genetic bottlenecks are, how they work, why they leave the signatures they do. Then, we can explore the specific evidence for humanity's bottleneck, the Toba eruption, the climate effects, the survival strategies, and then we can look at what came after, how the survivors rebuilt, how we went from a few thousand people clinging to existence to 8 billion people dominating the planet. It's one of the most remarkable comeback stories in the history of life on Earth, and it's written in our genes. Tonight, we're going to explore this mystery together. We'll look at the genetic evidence, examine the volcanic catastrophe, follow the survivors through the darkest period of human prehistory, and trace the path from near extinction to global dominance. We'll see how the bottleneck shaped us, what it cost us in genetic diversity, and what it might tell us about humanity's resilience. Get comfortable. Let these questions wash over you. And let's dive into the story of the day humanity almost ended, the genetic bottleneck that shouldn't exist but does, written into every cell of your body. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is a genetic bottleneck? The term comes from the shape you'd see if you could graph a population over time. Imagine a bottle on its side. The wide body of the bottle represents a large, stable population with high genetic diversity. Then, suddenly, the population has to pass through the narrow neck of the bottle. That's the bottleneck event, where something kills off most of the population and only a few individuals survive. After passing through the bottleneck, the population expands again, filling out the other side of the bottle. But it's different now. Smaller genetic diversity, different traits, forever marked by having passed through that narrow passage. These events are actually not that rare in evolutionary history. Many species have gone through bottlenecks. The classic example is cheetahs. About 10,000 years ago, cheetahs underwent a severe genetic bottleneck. The population crashed so hard that all modern cheetahs are almost genetically identical. They're like clones. You can do skin grafts between unrelated cheetahs, and they don't reject the tissue because their immune systems are so similar. That's an extreme bottleneck. The population lost almost all its genetic variation. Humans aren't quite that extreme, but we're closer to cheetahs than we should be for a species with billions of individuals. Our genetic diversity is surprisingly low, and we can measure this precisely. Geneticists use several metrics to quantify genetic diversity. Nucleotide diversity measures the average number of nucleotide differences between any two randomly chosen DNA sequences from the population. Heterozygosity measures how often individuals have two different versions of a gene. Haplotype diversity looks at combinations of genetic markers inherited together. Every one of these measures shows the same thing for humans. Low diversity, suspiciously low. Compare us to our closest relatives. Pan troglodytes, the common chimpanzee, has nucleotide diversity about 5 to 10 times higher than humans, despite having a population maybe 1/40th our size. Gorillas, with fewer than 100,000 individuals left, have higher genetic diversity than we do. Even bonobos, who went through their own bottleneck when they became geographically isolated south of the Congo River, have more genetic variation than humans. This pattern is consistent across all great apes. We're the genetic oddity, the species with low diversity despite high numbers. This tells us something important. Our low genetic diversity isn't due to our current population size. 8 billion people should have plenty of genetic variation if the population had been large for a long time. The low diversity must be due to something in our past, a historical event that reduced the population so severely that genetic variation was lost and never fully recovered. A bottleneck. But how do we know when the bottleneck happened? This is where it gets really clever. Geneticists can use what's called a molecular clock. Here's how it works. Mutations in DNA occur at roughly constant rates over time. Not the same for every gene or every type of mutation, but statistically, in large datasets, the rate is predictable. It's like radioactive decay, but for genetic changes. By comparing DNA sequences from different individuals or populations, scientists can count the number of differences and estimate how long ago those sequences shared a common ancestor. Using this technique on human mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child with minimal changes, researchers found something remarkable. All human mitochondrial DNA can be traced back to a single woman who lived somewhere in East Africa about 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. Scientists call her Mitochondrial Eve, though that's a bit misleading. She wasn't the only woman alive at the time. She's just the woman whose mitochondrial line survived to the present day. All the other mitochondrial lineages died out, meaning those women either had no children or had only sons, whose mitochondrial DNA doesn't pass on. But here's the interesting part. While mitochondrial Eve lived around 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, the mitochondrial diversity we see in modern humans suggests a more recent expansion from a much smaller population. The branching patterns in mitochondrial family trees show a sudden expansion starting around 60,000 on to 80,000 years ago. Before that point, there were fewer lineages, suggesting fewer people. After that point, rapid diversification, suggesting population growth. The same pattern shows up in Y chromosome DNA, which passes from father to son. All human Y chromosomes can be traced back to a single man, called Y chromosomal Adam, who lived somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Again, He wasn't the only man alive, just the only one whose Y chromosome lineage survived to today. And again, the diversity patterns suggest a bottleneck followed by expansion around 70,000 years ago. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam didn't live at the same time. They're separated by tens of thousands of years, and neither of them represents the actual bottleneck event. They represent the most recent common ancestors for those specific genetic systems. The bottleneck could have happened much later, after both of them lived. In fact, the evidence suggests exactly that. The severe population crash happened somewhere around 70,000 to 80,000 years ago, long after these ancestral individuals. When scientists analyze autosomal DNA, the chromosomes that come from both parents, they can get even more precise. Autosomal DNA recombines every generation, shuffling genetic information from both parents. This recombination acts like a clock, and by analyzing recombination patterns, researchers can estimate historical population sizes over time. These studies consistently show something dramatic: a severe dip in effective population size around 70,000 to 80,000 years ago. Some studies suggest the effective breeding population dropped to as few as 2,000 to 10,000 individuals. Others estimate slightly higher, maybe 10,000 to 20,000, but all agree there was a bottleneck, it was severe, and it happened in the relatively recent past. This isn't based on one study or one dataset. This conclusion comes from multiple independent research teams, using different methods, analyzing different genetic markers, studying different populations. They all converge on the same answer. Humanity nearly died out sometime around 70,000 years ago. The question is why? Enter Toba. In northern Sumatra, Indonesia, there's a massive lake. Lake Toba, about 60 miles long and 20 miles wide. Beautiful, serene, popular, with tourists. It's also a crater, the caldera of a supervolcano that exploded roughly 74,000 years ago in the most violent volcanic eruption of the last 2 million years. This wasn't a mountain that blew its top. This was a section of the Earth's crust that catastrophically failed, releasing magma and gas and rock with energy equivalent to roughly 1 million Hiroshima bombs. The eruption ejected an estimated 670 cubic miles of material. That's 2,800 cubic kilometers. To give you a sense of scale, the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in 1991, one of the largest eruptions of the 20th century, ejected about 2.4 cubic miles of material. Toba was nearly 300 times larger. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, which was heard 3,000 miles away and killed tens of thousands of people, ejected about 5 cubic miles. Toba was more than 130 times larger. When Toba erupted, it didn't just affect Indonesia. Ash rained down across South Asia. Deposits of Toba ash several meters thick have been found in India, over 2,000 miles from the eruption site. In some places, the ash layer is thick enough that it must have made the land temporarily uninhabitable. Anything living beneath several feet of volcanic ash wouldn't have survived. Trees would have been buried, rivers would have been clogged, water sources would have been contaminated with acidic runoff. But the local effects, devastating as they were, weren't the real danger. The real danger was global. When a supervolcano erupts, it injects material directly into the stratosphere, the upper layer of the atmosphere above where weather happens. Normal volcanic eruptions send most of their material into the troposphere, the lower atmosphere, where rain can wash it out in days or weeks. But stratospheric injection is different. There's no rain in the stratosphere, no weather to cleanse the air. Material that reaches the stratosphere can stay there for years, circling the globe, blocking sunlight. The Toba eruption sent sulfur dioxide and ash into the stratosphere in quantities that would have created what scientists call a volcanic winter. Sulfur dioxide reacts with water vapor to form sulfuric acid droplets, creating a reflective aerosol layer that bounces sunlight back into space before it can reach Earth's surface. The ash particles add to this effect, scattering and blocking light. The result is dramatic cooling. Global average temperatures can drop by several degrees Celsius. In some regions, especially higher latitudes, the drop can be 10 degrees or more. Ice core records from Greenland show a spike in sulfate deposits around 74,000 years ago, precisely matching the date of the Toba eruption. This confirms that Toba's aerosols reached even the Arctic, spreading worldwide. The cooling effects would have been global too, affecting every continent, every ecosystem, every species on Earth. For humans living 74,000 years ago, this would have been apocalyptic. Imagine the growing season suddenly shortened by weeks or months. Plants that depended on specific temperature ranges dying off. Animals that depended on those plants starving. Prey animals becoming scarce. Competition for remaining resources intensifying. And remember, this isn't a one-year event. The volcanic winter might have lasted for a decade or more. Some climate models suggest the cooling effects could have persisted for a century. The archaeological evidence from this period is sparse, but what exists is consistent with population crash. Sites that were occupied before roughly 75,000 years ago often show reduced occupation or abandonment afterward. The variety of stone tools decreases, suggesting less innovation and fewer people with specialized skills. The density of artifacts drops, indicating smaller populations. For several thousand years after Toba, the archaeological record looks like humanity was barely hanging on. Some scientists have questioned whether Toba alone could have caused such severe effects. Climate records from this period show conflicting signals. Some ice cores suggest cooling was less dramatic than models predict. Some pollen records from lake sediments show ecosystem changes, but not complete collapse. There's legitimate debate about exactly how bad the Toba winter was. Some researchers argue it was catastrophic, the worst climate event of the last 100,000 years. Others suggest it was severe, but not necessarily extinction level. But here's the thing. Even if Toba's effects were less severe than worst-case models suggest, we know something happened around that time. The genetic evidence is clear. Human populations crashed. Whether Toba was the sole cause or one factor among many, whether the climate effects lasted 10 years or 1,000, the end result is the same. By 70,000 years ago, there weren't many humans left on Earth, and whoever survived had to be incredibly tough, incredibly lucky, or both. Let's think about what survival would have required during this period. First, access to reliable food sources. In a world where most plant and animal populations crashed, surviving groups would need to be in locations with resilient food sources. Coastal areas with seafood, regions with diverse ecosystems that could buffer against climate extremes, areas with caves or rock shelters for protection against harsh conditions. Second, sufficient population size to remain viable. This is tricky. You need enough people to reproduce successfully, to maintain genetic diversity within your small group, to have enough adults to hunt, gather, care for children, and defend territory. but not so many people that you can't feed them all. During a resource crisis, the optimal group size might be 30 to 50 people. Too few, and you're vulnerable to random deaths destroying the group. Too many, and you can't feed everyone. Third, the ability to adapt rapidly. Groups that survived the bottleneck probably weren't the ones most specialized to their environment. Specialists do great when conditions are stable, but when everything changes, generalists survive. Groups that could switch food sources, learn new technologies quickly, cooperate effectively under stress, those are the ones that made it. Fourth, a bit of luck. Random chance plays a huge role in survival during catastrophes. Did your group happen to be near a reliable water source? Did you avoid the worst of the ashfall? Did you not get hit by one of the earthquakes that surely followed the eruption? Were you lucky enough that disease didn't sweep through your small population? Luck matters. The survivors of the Toba bottleneck, our ancestors, must have had all of these factors. They were in the right place. They had the right skills. They got lucky, and crucially, they cooperated. Small populations can't survive without cooperation. You need everyone contributing, everyone sharing, everyone working together. Individualistic, selfish behaviors that might work fine in a large population with abundant resources become fatal in a small population facing starvation. The bottleneck would have been a powerful selective pressure favoring cooperative, social behaviors. This might explain something interesting about modern humans. We're unusually social for great apes. Chimpanzees live in groups, sure, but their societies are marked by high levels of aggression, both between groups and within them. Humans are different. We're capable of cooperating with large numbers of unrelated individuals. We follow social norms. We have moral systems. We punish cheaters. We help strangers. This is weird from an evolutionary perspective. It requires costly behaviors that don't directly benefit the individual. But if the bottleneck selected strongly for cooperative groups, that could explain our unusual sociality. Groups that cooperated well survived. Groups that didn't perished. Over multiple generations of intense selection pressure, cooperative tendencies became hardwired into human psychology. We became, in effect, the cooperative ape, the species that survived extinction by learning to work together. There's another possibility, one that's more controversial but fascinating. Some researchers have suggested that the bottleneck, by creating small isolated populations under extreme stress, might have accelerated human cognitive evolution. Small populations experience genetic drift more intensely. Beneficial mutations can spread rapidly. Selective pressure is intense. And if certain cognitive abilities, like language, abstract thinking, or social intelligence, became crucial for survival during the bottleneck, those abilities could have been rapidly selected for. This might explain what archaeologists call the cognitive revolution, or the Great Leap Forward. Around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, the archaeological record shows a sudden appearance of undeniably modern human behaviors. Art, jewelry, sophisticated multi-component tools, long-distance trade networks, ceremonial burial, symbolic thinking. Before this period, the evidence for these behaviors is sparse or ambiguous. After it, they're everywhere. This timing coincides suspiciously well with the bottleneck. Did passing through the bottleneck somehow spark a cognitive revolution? Did the survival requirements of the post-Toba world favor enhanced cognitive abilities? Did isolated populations develop innovations that spread rapidly once populations expanded again. We don't know for certain, but the timing is striking. Bottleneck around 74,000 years ago. Cognitive revolution starting around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago. Rapid human expansion out of Africa around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. It all connects. What we know is this. Before the bottleneck, humans were anatomically modern but behaviorally limited. We were smart but not special. We were one of several human species on Earth. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans in Eastern Asia. Maybe other lineages we haven't discovered yet. Homo sapiens was not obviously destined for dominance. We were just another human variant trying to survive. After the bottleneck, everything changed. Modern human populations expanded rapidly out of Africa. We colonized new territories at unprecedented speed. We developed new technologies constantly. We outcompeted every other human species we encountered. Within 30,000 years, we'd spread across Europe, Asia, Australia. Within 60,000 years, we'd reached the Americas. We became the sole surviving human species, the only one left after millions of years of human evolution had produced dozens of different human types. That's not normal. That's not how evolution usually works. Something about post-bottleneck humans was different. Something made us uniquely successful. And that something seems to have emerged from the crucible of the near-extinction event 70,000 years ago. We're descendants of survivors. All of us. Every human alive today traces their ancestry back to those few thousand people who made it through the volcanic winter, who endured the climate chaos, who kept their groups together when everything was falling apart. And we carry the marks of that survival. Our low genetic diversity is the scar tissue from the bottleneck, a permanent reminder that we almost didn't make it. Our cooperative tendencies, our cognitive abilities, our behavioral flexibility, these might be the gifts that emerged from the crisis, the adaptations that let us not just survive, but thrive. But the story doesn't end with the bottleneck. After the survivors made it through, after the volcanic winter ended and the climate recovered, human populations began to expand. And this expansion is written in our genes as clearly as the bottleneck itself. We can trace the paths our ancestors took out of Africa, across continents, around the world. We can see how populations split and migrated and mixed. We can reconstruct the peopling of the entire planet from genetic data, and it all flows from that tiny ancestral population that survived the bottleneck. Let's look at what happened next. How did humanity go from a few thousand survivors to billions? How did we spread across the entire world? And what does the genetic evidence tell us about those ancient migrations that populated every corner of the Earth? After the bottleneck, after the worst of the volcanic winter passed, human populations began to recover. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The genetic evidence shows a clear signature of population expansion beginning around 65,000 to 70,000 years ago. Multiple genetic markers, analyzed by different research teams, all point to the same conclusion. Something around this time, human populations stopped declining and started growing. We'd survived the worst of it. Now came the recovery. But the recovery wasn't uniform. Different populations expanded at different rates, in different directions, carrying slightly different genetic signatures. By analyzing these patterns, geneticists can reconstruct ancient migrations with surprising precision. It's like reading a map written in DNA, where each population carries information about where it came from. when it split from other populations, and what route it took. The current genetic evidence suggests that all non-African populations descend from a single expansion out of Africa around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. There might have been earlier exits. Some fossils and archaeological sites suggest humans reached the Middle East as early as 100,000 to 120,000 years ago. But, if so, those populations either died out or left no genetic trace in modern people. The ancestors of everyone alive today, outside of Africa, descend from a single migration wave, roughly 65,000 years ago. This group, leaving Africa via the Middle East, might have numbered just a few hundred individuals initially. A tiny founding population carrying a subset of the genetic diversity present in African populations. This is why non-African populations have even less genetic diversity than African populations. They're descended from a subset of the survivors, a sample of a sample, carrying forward an even smaller slice of humanity's remaining genetic variation. From the Middle East, these populations split. One group moved east along the coast of South Asia, eventually reaching Southeast Asia and Australia. The speed of this coastal migration was remarkably fast. Archaeological evidence suggests humans reached Australia by at least 50,000 years ago, possibly earlier. That means they travelled from Africa to Australia, a distance of over 10,000 kilometres, crossing ocean straits and adapting to completely new environments in just 15,000 to 20,000 years. That's extraordinary. It averages out to roughly a kilometre every 2 years. But the actual movement pattern was probably more complex, with periods of rapid expansion punctuated by periods of settlement. How did they move so fast? Probably by following coastlines. Coastal environments provide reliable food sources: shellfish, fish, seabirds, marine mammals. They also provide a consistent environment. As you move along a coast, the basic ecological parameters remain similar. Temperature might change gradually, but you're always near water, always near food sources from the ocean. And early humans appear to have been skilled maritime adapters. They learned to exploit coastal resources efficiently and developed the boats or rafts needed to cross water barriers. The genetic signature of this coastal migration is still visible today. Populations in India, Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea, and Aboriginal Australians all share genetic markers indicating descent from this early coastal migration. These are often called the Southern Route populations. They represent the first major expansion out of Africa, the vanguard of humanity's colonization of the world. Meanwhile, back in the Middle East, another group was preparing for a different expansion. These populations, remaining in Western Asia for thousands of years, would eventually move north and west into Europe, and north and east into Central Asia and eventually East Asia. This northern expansion happened slightly later, probably around 45,000 to 55,000 years ago, and it faced different challenges. Moving into Europe and Northern Asia meant moving into colder climates, away from the equatorial warmth where humans had evolved. It meant encountering environments with harsh winters, seasonal extremes, and different prey animals. It also meant encountering other humans. Neanderthals had lived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, superbly adapted to the cold. Denisovans occupied parts of Asia. These weren't primitive humans. They were sophisticated, successful species with their own tools, their own cultures, their own territories. What happened when modern humans met Neanderthals and Denisovans is one of the most fascinating questions in human evolution. For a long time, scientists assumed modern humans simply outcompeted and replaced these archaic humans. We moved in, they died out. End of story. But when researchers began sequencing Neanderthal DNA, they found something surprising. Modern non-African humans carry Neanderthal DNA, usually about 1 to 2% of their genome. Clearly, there wasn't just competition, there was also interbreeding. Same story with Denisovans. Modern populations in Southeast Asia, Melanesia, and Australia carry Denisovan DNA, sometimes as much as 5% in some populations. The implication is clear. When modern humans expanded out of Africa and encountered these other human species, they didn't just fight or compete, they also interbred. There were hybrid populations, people with modern human mothers or fathers and Neanderthal or Denisovan mothers or fathers. Some of those hybrids survived, reproduced, and passed on genes from both species. This interbreeding has fascinating implications. First, it means that Neanderthals and Denisovans didn't completely go extinct. Parts of their genomes live on in modern humans. If you're of European or Asian descent, you're carrying genes from species that split from modern human ancestors hundreds of thousands of years ago. Second, some of the genes we inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans have been beneficial. Genes affecting immune function, skin and hair characteristics, adaptation to high altitude, these have been found to have Neanderthal or Denisovan origin. In effect, when modern humans moved into new environments where Neanderthals or Denisovans had lived for millennia, interbreeding gave us genes already adapted to those environments. It was like receiving a software update, optimized for local conditions. But most Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA that entered human genomes was eventually removed by selection. We can tell because Neanderthal ancestry is distributed in small chunks across the genome, not in large blocks. And certain regions of the genome have no Neanderthal ancestry at all, suggesting genes in those regions were harmful when mixed with modern human genes. The interbreeding happened, but most of the hybrid genes didn't persist. Only the beneficial or neutral ones remained. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were extinct. By 30,000 years ago, we have no evidence of any other human species anywhere. Homo sapiens was alone, the sole survivor of millions of years of human evolution. Why did we outlast our cousins? The answer probably involves multiple factors. We might have been better at adapting to climate changes. We might have had more advanced social structures, allowing larger group sizes. We might have had better communication abilities through more sophisticated language. Or we might have just been luckier, surviving random events that wiped out Neanderthal or Denisovan populations. What's clear is that post-bottleneck humans were extraordinarily successful at expanding into new environments and replacing or absorbing other human populations. From about 60,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago, modern humans spread across virtually every landmass on Earth. We reached Australia by 50,000 years ago. We'd colonized Europe by 45,000 years ago. We'd spread across Asia into Siberia by 30,000 years ago. We crossed into the Americas by at least 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier. We reached remote Pacific islands within the last 3,000 years. We went from a tiny population huddled in African refugia to a global species living in environments from deserts to tundra, from tropical rainforests to Arctic ice. The genetic evidence for these migrations is extraordinarily detailed. By analyzing mutations that accumulate at steady rates, researchers can build family trees showing how populations are related. By looking at which mutations are present in which populations, they can infer migration routes and timing. By examining the degree of genetic similarity between populations, they can estimate when they split from common ancestors. For example, Native American populations show clear genetic connection to East Asian populations, consistent with migration from Siberia across the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age. But they also show genetic signatures suggesting a founding population that was isolated for a period before expanding through the Americas. This matches archaeological evidence for a Beringian standstill, where populations remained in Beringia, the land bridge region, for perhaps several thousand years before moving south into the Americas. Australian Aboriginal populations show deep genetic divergence from other non-African populations, consistent with early isolation after reaching Australia 50,000 or more years ago. But they also show some genetic connection to modern South Asian populations, suggesting either ancient gene flow or shared ancestry from the coastal migration route. The picture is complex, but the broad outlines are clear. European populations show complex ancestry from multiple waves of migration. Hunter-gatherers who arrived 45,000 years ago, early farmers who arrived from Anatolia around 8,000 years ago, steppe pastoralists who arrived from Central Asia around 5,000 years ago. Modern Europeans are a mixture of these groups, with proportions varying by region. Again, the genetic evidence matches archaeological and linguistic evidence remarkably well. What's astonishing is that all of this diversity, all of these different populations spread across the globe, adapted to radically different environments, speaking thousands of different languages, all descend from that tiny bottleneck population 70,000 years ago. The genetic diversity we see in modern humans, despite being low compared to other species, all generated in just the last 60,000 to 70,000 years. That's recent. That's fast. That's evidence of rapid population expansion from a small source. And here's something that should make you pause. Despite all our apparent diversity, despite all our different cultures and adaptations, genetically, we're remarkably similar. Any two random humans are more genetically similar to each other than two chimpanzees from the same forest. The genetic differences that underlie what we think of as race, skin color, facial features, hair type, these are superficial variations affecting a tiny fraction of our genome. More than 99.9% of your DNA is identical to that of any other human on Earth. We're one family, one species, one people, all descended from the same small ancestral population that survived the bottleneck. This has profound implications. It means that racism has no genetic basis. The concept of distinct human races is biologically meaningless. There's more genetic variation within any population than there is between populations. An African person and an Asian person might be more genetically similar than two African people from different regions. The visible differences we focus on, skin color, eye shape, hair, texture, are controlled by a handful of genes and were shaped by relatively recent adaptation to local climates. They're cosmetic variations, not fundamental differences. It also means that any human population is capable of the same intellectual, creative, and cultural achievements as any other. The differences we see in human societies are due to history, geography, culture, and circumstance, not genetics. The reason some societies developed writing earlier, or agriculture earlier, or cities earlier, has nothing to do with genetic differences between populations. It has to do with environmental factors, available domesticable plants and animals, trade networks, and pure historical contingency. This is one of the gifts of genetic research. It's provided scientific evidence for what ethical thinking should have always told us. We're one species with one origin and one shared ancestry. The divisions we create between each other are cultural constructs, not biological realities. We're all descendants of bottleneck survivors, all products of the same near-extinction event, all carrying the same genetic heritage from those who held on when everything was falling apart. But the bottleneck didn't just shape our genetics, it shaped our biology in other ways, ways that still affect us today. Let's look at what else happened during and after the bottleneck, what we lost and what we gained, and how it made us into the species we are. One of the most significant consequences of the genetic bottleneck is something called low genetic diversity, and it shows up in some surprising places. Take immune system genes. Your immune system recognizes pathogens by comparing them against a library of genetic patterns. The more diverse your immune genes, the more patterns you can recognize, the better protected you are against diseases. Humans have much lower diversity in certain immune system genes than other primates. This makes us more vulnerable to certain pathogens. When a new disease emerges, there's a higher chance that most humans will be susceptible because we don't have the genetic variation needed to resist it. Think about pandemics throughout history. The Black Death killed a third of Europe's population. Smallpox devastated Native American populations who had no resistance. The 1918 flu killed 50 million people globally. HIV has killed over 35 million people since it emerged. Part of the reason these diseases can spread so effectively through human populations is our low genetic diversity. We're all similar enough that a pathogen adapted to infect one person can often infect many others. In a more genetically diverse species, pathogens would have a harder time spreading because different individuals would have different susceptibilities. This has real implications for modern medicine. When researchers develop vaccines, they work extremely well in humans because we're so genetically similar. A vaccine that protects one person is likely to protect most others. That's good, but it also means that if a pathogen evolves to evade vaccine-induced immunity, it might evade it in almost everyone. Our similarity is both our strength and our vulnerability. The bottleneck also affected our reproductive biology in subtle ways. Genetic diversity is important for fertility. Inbreeding, mating between close relatives, reduces fertility because it increases the chances of harmful recessive genes pairing up. Human populations with low genetic diversity show patterns consistent with what you'd see in inbred populations, even when people aren't actually closely related. Higher rates of certain genetic disorders, slightly reduced fertility, increased vulnerability to environmental stresses. We're not severely inbred, but we're more inbred than we should be for a species with billions of members. This shows up in some surprising statistics. Human fertility, the ability to conceive and carry a pregnancy to term, is relatively low compared to other mammals. Human pregnancies have a high miscarriage rate. Many fertilized eggs fail to implant. Many early pregnancies end in spontaneous abortion. Some of this is due to our unusual reproductive biology, the costs of large brains and bipedalism. But some of it might be due to our low genetic diversity. With less variation, there's a higher chance of genetic incompatibilities between mother and fetus, leading to pregnancy loss. The bottleneck also limited our ability to adapt to new diseases. Adaptation requires genetic variation. If a population faces a new pathogen, individuals with resistance genes survive and reproduce more, spreading those genes through the population. But if the variation isn't there, if the bottleneck eliminated those resistance genes, the population has no way to adapt. This might explain why certain diseases disproportionately affect humans compared to other species. We simply lost the genetic variation needed to resist them. But it's not all negative. The bottleneck also created opportunities for certain beneficial traits to spread. Remember, in a small population, beneficial mutations can become common very quickly. If a useful mutation arises in a population of 1 million, it might take tens of thousands of years to spread to high frequency. But in a population of 1,000, it could reach high frequency in just a few hundred generations. The bottleneck accelerated human evolution in some ways, even as it limited diversity in others. Some researchers have suggested that human cognitive abilities might have been enhanced during the bottleneck period. The argument goes like this. In a small population facing extreme survival pressure, any cognitive advantages, better memory, more effective communication, improved social cognition, would have strong selective benefits. Groups with slightly better cognitive abilities would survive at higher rates. Over multiple generations, these abilities would become fixed in the population. When the population expanded again, everyone would carry these enhanced cognitive traits. This is speculative, and it's hard to test directly. We can't measure the cognitive abilities of people who lived 70,000 years ago. But we can look at the timing of behavioral changes in the archaeological record. And as mentioned earlier, there's a striking correspondence between the bottleneck and the emergence of modern human behavior. Around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, we see the first undeniable evidence of symbolic thinking, art, complex tool manufacture, long-distance trade, and sophisticated social organization. These behaviors appear suddenly, or at least, they suddenly become common enough to show up frequently in the archaeological record. Did the bottleneck cause this? It's possible. The intense selective pressure of the post-Toba world might have favored groups with better cognitive abilities. Or it might have eliminated populations that hadn't developed these abilities, leaving only the most cognitively advanced groups as survivors. Either way, the people who made it through the bottleneck were, apparently, the ones capable of modern human behavior. Another possibility is that the bottleneck didn't cause the cognitive changes, but facilitated their spread. If a beneficial cognitive mutation arose in one small population during the bottleneck, it could spread rapidly as that population expanded. In a large, continuous population, new mutations spread slowly because they have to compete with all the existing genetic variation. But in a small population expanding into empty territory, new mutations can surf the wave of population expansion, reaching high frequency quickly. Whatever the mechanism, there's no question that post-bottleneck humans were different from pre-bottleneck humans. Not anatomically, our skeletons are essentially identical going back 200,000 years. But behaviorally, after the bottleneck, we were more innovative, more adaptive, more successful. We spread across the globe, colonized every continent, outlasted every other human species, and began the long march towards civilization. But let's not romanticize this too much. The survivors weren't superhumans. They were just lucky. Lucky to be in the right place when Toba erupted. lucky to have access to food when most resources were scarce, lucky to be part of groups that cooperated well under stress, lucky to avoid disease, accidents, predators, and the 1,000 other dangers that could kill you in the Stone Age. Survival doesn't require perfection. It just requires being good enough and lucky enough to make it through. And many weren't lucky. Most humans alive before the bottleneck died. Their genetic lineages ended. Their experiences, their knowledge, their cultures, gone. We only remember the survivors, but the dead outnumbered them vastly. For every person who made it through, how many perished? 10, 100? We'll never know. But we should remember that the bottleneck wasn't just a fascinating genetic event. It was a catastrophe, a near extinction, a time of starvation and death on a scale hard to imagine. When you think about the bottleneck, it's tempting to focus on the numbers. 2,000 breeding individuals, 70,000 years ago, 670 cubic miles of erupted material. These numbers make it feel abstract, scientific, distant. But behind every statistic were real people, individuals with names, even if we don't know them, people with hopes and fears and loved ones, children who watched their parents starve, parents who watched their children die, elders who saw their whole world collapse and couldn't do anything to stop it. They didn't know they were passing through a genetic bottleneck. They didn't understand that they were the survivors whose descendants would inherit the earth. They just knew they were cold and hungry and scared. They knew the sky was dark and the food was running out. They knew they might not survive the winter, and most of them didn't. So, while we can analyze the bottleneck scientifically, while we can extract its signatures from DNA and model its effects on population genetics, we should also acknowledge it emotionally. This was one of the worst disasters in human history. Not the worst in terms of absolute numbers. Modern wars and famines have killed more people, but the worst in terms of proportion. What other event brought our species so close to extinction? What other catastrophe eliminated such a large fraction of humanity? And yet, from this catastrophe came opportunity. The species that emerged from the bottleneck was leaner, tougher, more adaptable. We'd been tested in the worst way possible and passed. We'd proven we could survive anything, and we carried that resilience forward. When we encountered new environments, we adapted. When we met other challenges, we overcame them. When we faced other human species, we outlasted them. The bottleneck survivors were the ancestors of a species that would come to dominate the planet. But we also carried forward the scars. Our low genetic diversity is permanent. Short of genetic engineering, which raises all sorts of ethical questions, we can't increase our genetic variation. We're stuck with what the bottleneck left us. And that makes us vulnerable. Vulnerable to new diseases. Vulnerable to genetic disorders. Vulnerable to any catastrophe that requires genetic variation to overcome. This is worth remembering as we face current global challenges. Climate change, pandemics, environmental destruction. These are threats to all of humanity. And because we're so genetically similar, because we're all descended from that small bottleneck population, we're all vulnerable in similar ways. There's no hidden reserve of human genetic diversity waiting to save us if things go wrong. We've got what we've got, and that's all we've got. On the other hand, our genetic similarity also means we're all in this together. There are no subspecies of humans, no master races, no genetic hierarchies. We're one family, one species, one people. The differences between us are trivial compared to our shared heritage. And if we're going to survive the challenges ahead, we'll need to act like it. We'll need cooperation on a global scale, just like our ancestors needed cooperation to survive the bottleneck. In some ways, we're facing a new kind of bottleneck. Not a genetic one, but an existential one. Will we cooperate to solve climate change, or will we let it spiral out of control? Will we manage resources sustainably, or will we deplete them to the point of collapse? Will we preserve biodiversity, or will we drive countless species extinct? The choices we make now will determine whether humanity has a long future or a short one. And just as the Toba bottleneck shaped human evolution by selecting for certain traits, our current challenges are shaping human culture by selecting for certain values. Will we develop cultures that prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term gain? Will we develop institutions that can coordinate global action? Will we develop technologies that let us thrive without destroying our environment? These are the tests we face. Not genetic tests this time, but cultural and technological ones. The story of the genetic bottleneck has lessons for us. It shows us that humans can survive catastrophic events. It also shows us that survival comes at a cost, that disasters leave permanent marks on species. It reminds us that we're vulnerable, that our dominance of the planet isn't guaranteed, that circumstances beyond our control can threaten our existence. But it also reminds us that we're resilient, that we're capable of adapting to new situations, that cooperation and innovation can overcome seemingly impossible challenges. So, what have we learned tonight? We've learned that humanity went through at least one severe genetic bottleneck, probably around 70,000 to 80,000 years ago. We've learned that this bottleneck reduced human genetic diversity permanently, leaving us more similar to each other than we might otherwise be. We've learned that the bottleneck was likely triggered by the Toba supervolcano eruption and the volcanic winter that followed. We've learned that the survivors of the bottleneck were the ancestors of all modern humans, and that their descendants spread across the globe in just tens of thousands of years. We've learned that the bottleneck might have accelerated certain evolutionary changes, possibly contributing to the emergence of modern human behavior and cognition. We've learned that interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans gave us genes adapted to environments outside Africa. And we've learned that our low genetic diversity makes us both strong and vulnerable, similar enough to cooperate globally, but similar enough to be threatened by shared vulnerabilities. Most importantly, we've learned that we're all connected. Every human on Earth is related through that tiny ancestral population that survived when everything was falling apart. We're one family, descendants of survivors, carriers of their genetic legacy. The differences between us are recent and superficial. The similarities run deep, written into every cell of our bodies. If you're still awake, or if you're drifting in that pleasant space between sleep and consciousness, let this sink in. You're part of an unbroken chain of survival, stretching back 70,000 years, back through the bottleneck, back to a time when your ancestors huddled together in the darkness of volcanic winter, and somehow held on. They survived so you could exist. Every choice they made, every danger they faced, every moment they could have died but didn't, led eventually to you. That's not mystical thinking. That's just how ancestry works. If any of your direct ancestors had died before reproducing, you wouldn't be here. And given how close humanity came to extinction during the bottleneck, the odds that your specific ancestors survived are astronomically small. You're the product of an incredibly improbable chain of survival events. Everyone is. So, next time you look at another person, any person from any background, remember that you're looking at someone whose ancestors survived the same catastrophe yours did. You're looking at a distant cousin, separated by perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 generations, but still family. Still part of the same lineage of survivors. Still carrying the same genetic signature of humanity's brush with extinction. And maybe that should change how we treat each other. If we're all family, all survivors of the same ancient disaster, maybe we should act like it. Maybe we should cooperate more. Maybe we should help each other through challenges the way our ancestors helped each other through volcanic winter. Maybe we should remember that we're all in this together, and we always have been. The genetic bottleneck is written into our DNA, but its lessons are written into our history. We're a species that almost didn't make it. We're survivors of catastrophe. We're descendants of the tough, the lucky, the cooperative. And we're facing new challenges that will test whether we've learned anything from our ancestors' survival. So, as you drift off to sleep, think about those survivors 70,000 years ago. Think about what they endured. Think about how they held on when everything was falling apart. Think about how their story is your story, how their survival is your existence. And maybe think about what stories our descendants will tell about us. Will we be remembered as the generation that rose to meet our challenges? Or will we be remembered as the generation that failed, that had all the advantages of civilization and technology, but couldn't muster the cooperation needed to survive? The choice is ours, but the example of our ancestors is clear. Survival is possible. Cooperation works. Resilience matters. We have it in us to survive because we're descended from survivors. The question is whether we'll use that inheritance wisely. Sweet dreams. And remember, you're here because your ancestors made it through the worst day in human history. That's something to be proud of. That's something to live up to. That's the legacy we all carry, written into our genes, passed down through 70,000 years from that tiny population that refused to give up, even when the sky went dark and the world turned cold. We're the descendants of bottleneck survivors, all of us. And that's a story worth remembering. Thank you for joining me on this journey through human prehistory. If you enjoyed exploring the genetic bottleneck, hit that like button and subscribe for more videos on history's greatest mysteries. And leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Are you in Africa, the continent where the bottleneck survivors held on? In Europe or Asia, where their descendants spread and thrived? In the Americas, reached by their descendants after tens of thousands of years of migration? In Australia, one of the earliest stops on humanity's global expansion? Wherever you are, you're part of this story. You're carrying the evidence in your DNA. You're a living testament to the resilience of the species that almost didn't make it but did. Sleep well. Dream of volcanic winters and survivors, of tiny populations holding on against impossible odds, of the moment when everything could have ended but didn't. Dream of your ancestors, whoever they were, wherever they were, keeping the chain of life unbroken through the darkness. You're here because they didn't give up. That's worth celebrating. That's worth protecting. And maybe when you wake up, you'll remember that every person you see is part of the same story, carrying the same legacy, descended from the same survivors. We're all in this together. We always have been. The bottleneck proved it. Our shared genetics confirm it. The question is whether we'll act like it. But before we finish this journey, there's more to explore. Because the story of the genetic bottleneck isn't just about what happened 70,000 years ago. It's about what that event reveals about human biology, about evolution, about the nature of survival itself. And there are layers to this story we haven't fully examined yet. Mysteries within the mystery. Questions that keep geneticists awake at night. So let's dive deeper. Let's look at the actual science, the methods researchers use to detect bottlenecks, the debates about timing and severity, and what it all means for understanding who we are. When geneticists talk about a population bottleneck, they're describing something very specific. It's not just that the population got smaller. Populations fluctuate all the time. A harsh winter might kill half a population, but if that population rebounds quickly, the genetic effects are minimal. A bottleneck has lasting genetic consequences because the population stays small for multiple generations. During that time, genetic drift becomes the dominant evolutionary force. Genetic drift is random change in gene frequencies. In a large population, random effects cancel out. If a helpful mutation arises, it has a good chance of spreading because natural selection has time to work. If a neutral or slightly harmful mutation arises, it's likely to be lost because it's rare. But in a small population, randomness matters more. A mutation might spread just because the individual carrying it happened to have more children, not because the mutation was beneficial. Or a beneficial mutation might be lost because the individual carrying it got unlucky and died young. This means small populations evolve differently than large ones. They lose genetic diversity rapidly. They accumulate slightly harmful mutations that would have been eliminated in a larger population. They're more vulnerable to inbreeding, and they develop a specific genetic signature that we can detect tens of thousands of years later by analyzing modern DNA. The signature shows up in several ways. First, reduced nucleotide diversity. If you compare two random human genomes, you'll find they're about 99.9% identical at the nucleotide level. Only 1 in every 1,000 DNA letters differs between individuals. That seems small, but it's still millions of differences across the whole genome. But if you compare human genomes to chimpanzee genomes from different populations, chimps show much more diversity. They have differences at about 5 to 10 positions for every 1,000 compared, depending on which populations you look at. This is weird. We have a vastly larger population than chimps, yet we have less genetic diversity. The only explanation is that our population was very small in the recent past, small enough and for long enough that we lost most of our genetic variation. The bottleneck erased diversity that would take hundreds of thousands of years to rebuild through new mutations. Second, the pattern of linkage disequilibrium. This is a technical term for when genetic variants that are close together on a chromosome tend to be inherited together. In a large population with a long history, recombination, the shuffling of DNA during reproduction, breaks up these associations. Variants that started out linked become independent over time. But in a small population, especially after a bottleneck, linkage persists longer because there are fewer recombination events, and because the population started from a small number of founder genomes. Modern humans show more linkage disequilibrium than expected for a species with our population size. This indicates our population expanded recently from a small base. We haven't had enough generations of recombination to break up all the associations created during the bottleneck. It's like we're still carrying signatures of the small founder population in the structure of our genomes. Third, the site frequency spectrum. This refers to how common different variants are in the population. In a large, stable population, you expect a specific distribution. Rare variants are most common because new mutations arise all the time but haven't spread yet. Intermediate frequency variants are less common. Very common variants, ones that have been around long enough and beneficial enough to spread through most of the population, are relatively rare. But after a bottleneck and subsequent expansion, this distribution gets distorted. You see an excess of rare variants because the population expanded rapidly and new mutations appeared faster than they could be sorted by selection. The human site frequency spectrum matches the pattern expected after a severe bottleneck followed by rapid expansion. Fourth, the patterns in mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA. These genetic systems don't recombine, so they're passed down intact from mother to child or father to son. This makes them perfect for tracing lineages back in time. When researchers build family trees from mitochondrial DNA, comparing sequences from people around the world, they find that all branches trace back to a common ancestor who lived about 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. But, and this is crucial, the tree shows a pattern of reduced lineages during a specific time period. Before about 70,000 years ago, there are fewer branches. After that point, rapid diversification. This pattern is exactly what you'd expect if the population crashed around 70,000 years ago and then expanded rapidly. The Y chromosome tells a similar story. All human Y chromosomes trace back to a common ancestor, and the tree shows the same pattern. Reduced diversity followed by rapid expansion starting around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. The fact that both systems, which are inherited independently, show the same pattern at the same time is powerful evidence for a real demographic event. It's not just statistical noise. Something happened around 70,000 years ago that affected the entire human population. Now, you might wonder, how do we know these dates? How can geneticists say with such confidence that the bottleneck happened 70,000 years ago, rather than 50,000 or 100,000? The answer lies in mutation rates and the molecular clock. DNA mutations occur at roughly constant rates over time. Not exactly constant. There's some variation depending on generation time, environmental factors, and other variables. But statistically, across many genes and many lineages, the average mutation rate is predictable. By comparing DNA sequences from different species and calibrating against known evolutionary splits, like the human-chimpanzee split around 6 to 7 million years ago, researchers can estimate how fast mutations accumulate. Then, by counting the number of mutations between DNA sequences from different humans, they can estimate how long ago those sequences shared a common ancestor. It's like measuring the distance between 2 points and calculating travel time if you know the speed. For humans, the mutation rate is estimated at about 1 to 1.5 times 10 to the negative 8th power per nucleotide per generation. That means, in each generation, each DNA letter has about a 1 in 100 million chance of mutating. That sounds small, but humans have about 3 billion DNA letters, and there are billions of humans, so mutations are constantly occurring. Over time, these mutations accumulate, and by counting them, we can estimate time since common ancestry. Using these methods, multiple research teams have converged on similar dates for the human bottleneck. Some studies suggest 50,000 to 70,000 years ago. Others suggest 70,000 to 90,000 years ago. There's uncertainty because mutation rates aren't perfectly constant, and because different analysis methods make different assumptions. But the central estimate clusters around 70,000 years ago, plus or minus 10,000 years, and that timing matches the Toba eruption almost perfectly. The Toba eruption is dated through multiple independent methods. Argon-argon dating of volcanic minerals gives an age of about 73,000 to 74,000 years ago. Ice core records showing the sulfate spike are dated through counting annual layers, giving similar ages. The correlation isn't perfect. Genetic dates have uncertainty. Radiometric dates have uncertainty. Ice core dates have uncertainty. But the overlap is too close to be coincidental. A massive volcanic eruption that would have caused global climate disruption occurred at almost exactly the time genetic evidence suggests human populations crashed. That's not proof of causation. Correlation isn't causation, but it's strongly suggestive. Some researchers have questioned the Toba catastrophe hypothesis. They point out that some archaeological sites show continuous occupation through the Toba period. They note that some climate records don't show the expected cooling. They argue that humans might have been more resilient than the catastrophe theory assumes, and they're right to be skeptical. Good science requires questioning every hypothesis, looking for alternative explanations, demanding strong evidence. But the genetic evidence for a bottleneck is independent of Toba. Even if Toba's effects were less severe than initially thought, we still need to explain the genetic signatures of population crash. If not Toba, then what? Some researchers have proposed that the bottleneck might have been caused by a different climate event, or by a combination of factors rather than a single catastrophe. The end of an interglacial period, increasing aridity in Africa, competition with other human species, disease outbreaks. Any or all of these might have contributed. The truth is probably complex. Major demographic events usually have multiple causes. Toba might have been the trigger, the immediate catastrophe that killed vast numbers. But underlying vulnerabilities, already stressed populations, marginal environments, these would have made the impact worse. And the recovery period, the time when populations remained small, might have lasted longer because of ongoing challenges, not just the volcanic winter itself. What's clear is that the bottleneck happened. The genetic evidence is overwhelming. Human populations crashed to very low numbers sometime in the past 100,000 years, most likely around 70,000 years ago. The survivors were probably concentrated in a few refugia, mostly in Africa, possibly with small populations in southern Asia. These survivors were the ancestors of all modern humans, and their descendants, expanding from this small base, eventually populated the entire world. Let's think about what it actually means to have an effective population of 2,000 to 10,000 individuals. Effective population size isn't the same as census population, the total number of people alive. It's the number of individuals actually contributing genes to the next generation. In any population, not everyone reproduces. Some people die young. Some choose not to have children. Some have children who don't survive to adulthood. The effective population is always smaller than the census population, often by a factor of 2 or 3. So, if the effective population was 2,000 to 10,000, the actual census population might have been 6,000 to 30,000. That's a plausible number for the global human population during a severe crisis. Imagine 20,000 people scattered across Africa and possibly southern Asia, organized into bands of 30 to 50 individuals, groups separated by hundreds of miles of hostile territory. That's all of humanity. Everyone alive today descends from those 20,000 people, and probably from a subset of them, the ones lucky enough to have surviving lineages all the way to the present. Now, think about the implications. With such a small population, the human species was extraordinarily vulnerable. A single epidemic could have killed half of us. A regional climate disaster could have eliminated entire populations. A bad decade of drought could have driven us extinct. We were balanced on a knife edge, one disaster away from joining the Neanderthals and Denisovans in extinction. The fact that we survived is, in some ways, a historical accident. We got lucky, but it wasn't just luck. The survivors must have had advantages. Maybe they lived in particularly favorable environments, coastal regions with reliable food sources, areas buffered from the worst climate effects. Maybe they had cultural advantages, better tools, more effective social organization, superior hunting strategies. Maybe they had genetic advantages, though with such low diversity, it's hard to see what those would have been. More likely, it was a combination. The right place at the right time with the right skills and the right social structures. One thing we can be fairly certain about is that the survivors were cooperative. Small populations can't survive without cooperation. When resources are scarce and conditions are harsh, every individual needs to contribute. Selfish individuals, people who take more than their share or refuse to help others, become liabilities. In a large population, you can afford some freeloaders. In a population of 30 people facing starvation, you can't. Everyone pulls together or everyone dies. This might have been a crucial selective pressure. Groups with strong cooperative norms, with effective mechanisms for punishing cheaters and rewarding contributors, would have survived at higher rates than groups with weaker social cohesion. Over multiple generations, genes and cultural practices that promoted cooperation would spread, while those that promoted selfishness would be eliminated. The bottleneck might have, in effect, selected for cooperativeness, creating a species predisposed to work together. Modern humans are indeed unusually cooperative for primates. We help strangers. We follow social norms, even when no one is watching. We feel guilt when we violate moral rules. We punish cheaters, even at cost to ourselves. These traits are puzzling from an evolutionary perspective because they're costly, but they make sense if you think about survival through a bottleneck. Groups that could cooperate survived. Groups that couldn't perished. We're descendants of the cooperative groups. This has implications for understanding human nature. Are humans naturally selfish or naturally cooperative? The answer might be both, depending on context. In large, anonymous populations, where cooperation can't be enforced, selfishness might be adaptive. But in small, interdependent groups, where everyone knows everyone else, cooperation is essential. The bottleneck was the ultimate small group situation, and we're descendants of people who excelled at small group cooperation. There's another dimension to the bottleneck worth exploring, the psychological dimension. What was it like, psychologically, to live through an extinction-level event? How did it affect human culture, human mythology, human worldview? We have no direct evidence, obviously, no written records, no contemporary accounts, but we can speculate based on what we know about human psychology and how people respond to catastrophes. First, there would have been grief, unimaginable, overwhelming grief, watching people you love starve, watching children die from cold and hunger, watching your community shrink year after year as more people succumbed. Survivor's guilt. Why did I survive when so many others died? What makes me special? What did I do to deserve survival? These are universal human responses to catastrophic loss. Second, there would have been fear, constant, grinding fear. Will there be food tomorrow? Will the cold ever end? Will we survive another winter? Fear is adaptive in dangerous situations. It keeps you cautious, keeps you vigilant. But chronic fear is exhausting. It wears you down mentally and physically, living through years of crisis, never knowing if conditions would improve. That would take an enormous psychological toll. Third, there would have been religious or spiritual responses. Humans are meaning-making creatures. We need explanations for why things happen. When the sky goes dark and stays dark, when the world becomes hostile and cold, people look for reasons. Maybe the gods are angry. Maybe we violated some taboo. Maybe we need to perform certain rituals to appease the forces causing this disaster. We have no idea what specific beliefs the bottleneck survivors held, but it would be astonishing if they didn't develop some kind of explanatory framework. And fourth, there would have been resilience. Human beings are remarkably resilient. We adapt. We find meaning even in suffering. We maintain hope even in desperate situations. The survivors of the bottleneck kept going. They didn't give up. They found ways to survive, to maintain social bonds, to preserve their cultures. They told stories. They made tools. They cared for each other. And eventually, when conditions improved, they rebuilt. This resilience is part of our heritage. We're descendants of people who survived the worst. We carry their genes, their legacy, their determination. When modern humans face catastrophes, when we endure wars, famines, pandemics, plagues, we draw on reserves of resilience that trace back to the bottleneck survivors. They didn't quit, and neither do we. There's something profoundly moving about this continuity, an unbroken chain of human experience stretching back 70,000 years. Your ancestors survived. They had children who survived. Those children had children who survived. Generation after generation, through ice ages and droughts, through the rise and fall of entire civilizations, through every challenge history could throw at them, your lineage survived. And it led to you. This isn't mysticism. This is just how ancestry works, but it's worth pausing to appreciate. The odds against your existence are astronomical. If any one of your thousands of direct ancestors had died before reproducing, you wouldn't exist. And given how close humanity came to extinction during the bottleneck, the fact that your specific lineage made it through is incredibly improbable. You're the product of the luckiest, toughest, most resilient lineage in human history. Every person is. So, what does all this mean for us today? What lessons can we draw from the genetic bottleneck? First, it reminds us that human existence is fragile. We're not guaranteed survival. We came close to extinction once, maybe multiple times. It could happen again. Our current dominance of the planet, our massive population, our technological sophistication, none of this guarantees we'll survive future catastrophes. Complacency is dangerous. Second, it shows us that cooperation is essential for survival. The bottleneck survivors cooperated. They had to. Modern humans face global challenges that require global cooperation. Climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation. These are threats that no nation can address alone. We need the same spirit of cooperation that carried our ancestors through the bottleneck. Third, it demonstrates that diversity is valuable. The bottleneck reduced our genetic diversity, and that makes us vulnerable. We can't undo that, but we can preserve and celebrate our cultural diversity. Different cultures represent different solutions to the problem of how to be human. Different knowledge systems, different values, different ways of organizing society. This diversity is a resource. Losing it would be like losing genetic diversity, a reduction in our species' adaptive capacity. Fourth, it reminds us that we're all related, all part of one family. The genetic evidence is clear. We all descend from the same small population. We're all carrying the same bottleneck signature. We're all products of the same survival story. The differences between us, real as they are culturally and individually, are genetically trivial. We're one species, one people, all in this together. And fifth, it shows us that recovery is possible. The bottleneck could have been the end of humanity. Instead, it was a temporary setback. The survivors rebuilt. Their descendants thrived. Within 60,000 years, we'd gone from a few thousand individuals huddled in refugia to a global species dominating every ecosystem. That's an incredible comeback. It proves that humans are resilient, that we can recover from catastrophes, that survival is possible even after the worst disasters. These lessons feel especially relevant today. We're living through challenging times. Climate change threatens to disrupt global systems. Political divisions strain societies. Pandemics remind us of our vulnerability. It's easy to feel pessimistic, to think that maybe humanity's best days are behind us, that maybe we're heading towards some kind of collapse. But the genetic bottleneck tells a different story. It tells us that humans have survived worse, that cooperation and resilience work, that recovery is possible, that we've got what it takes because we're descended from survivors. Now, there's one more aspect of the bottleneck we should explore. The question of whether it might happen again. Could modern humanity face another genetic bottleneck? What would it take? And what would the consequences be? These aren't just academic questions. They're relevant to thinking about existential risks, about how we prepare for potential catastrophes, about what we need to preserve to ensure humanity's long-term survival. A modern bottleneck would require something that killed billions of people and reduced the population to a tiny fraction of current numbers. What could do that? Nuclear war, certainly. A full-scale nuclear exchange between major powers could kill billions directly and indirectly through nuclear winter, collapsed food systems, and societal breakdown. Engineered pandemics, potentially. As biotechnology advances, the risk increases that someone could intentionally or accidentally create a pathogen far more deadly than anything natural. Asteroid impact, possibly. A large enough asteroid striking Earth could trigger climate effects similar to Toba, though we're much better at detecting and potentially deflecting asteroids now than humans were 70,000 years ago. Climate change probably couldn't cause a bottleneck on its own, not in the timescales we're discussing. But it could destabilize civilization enough to make other catastrophes more likely. Failed states, resource wars, mass migrations. These increase the chances of nuclear conflict or bioterrorism. So, climate change might be an indirect cause of a future bottleneck, even if it's not the direct trigger. If a modern bottleneck occurred, the genetic effects would be different from the ancient one in some ways. We're starting from a much more diverse base, genetically speaking. Modern populations have had 70,000 years to accumulate new mutations, to develop regional variations, to rebuild some genetic diversity. A bottleneck now would reduce that diversity, but probably not eliminate it completely. Depending on which populations survived, different genetic variants would be preserved. There's also the possibility of deliberate genetic preservation. We have the technology to freeze and store DNA, embryos, even eggs and sperm. In principle, we could create genetic archives that could help rebuild diversity after a bottleneck. Some researchers have proposed exactly this, creating genetic banks as insurance against catastrophic population loss. It's an interesting idea, though it raises ethical questions about who decides what gets preserved and how it gets used. But let's be honest, the best approach is prevention. Instead of planning how to survive a bottleneck, we should be working to prevent one from happening. That means addressing existential risks seriously, reducing nuclear arsenals, regulating biotechnology responsibly, monitoring for asteroid threats, mitigating climate change. These aren't abstract concerns. They're real risks to human survival, and we have the knowledge and resources to address them if we choose to. The genetic bottleneck 70,000 years ago wasn't chosen. It was imposed by circumstances beyond human control. A volcano erupted, the climate shifted, people died. The survivors had no choice but to endure. But we have choices. We can see risks coming. We can take action to prevent catastrophes. We can cooperate globally to address shared threats. The question is whether we will, whether we'll learn from our ancestors' experience and work to ensure that humanity never faces another bottleneck. There's something both humbling and empowering about understanding the genetic bottleneck. Humbling because it reminds us how close we came to not existing, how fragile human existence is, how much we owe to luck and to the resilience of ancestors we'll never know. But also empowering because it proves that survival is possible, that humans can endure unimaginable hardships and come out the other side, that cooperation and innovation can overcome catastrophic challenges, that recovery is always possible if we don't give up. You carry this history in your genes. Every cell in your body contains DNA shaped by the bottleneck. You're a walking record of humanity's brush with extinction, and you're also a testament to survival, to the fact that our ancestors held on when everything was falling apart, to the reality that the human spirit is more resilient than we sometimes think. So, as we near the end of this journey, as you drift towards sleep, or simply let these ideas settle into your consciousness, remember what we've discovered. We've seen how genetic evidence reveals a dramatic population crash around 70,000 years ago. We've explored the Toba supervolcano and its devastating effects on global climate. We've examined how small populations lose genetic diversity and why that signature persists for tens of thousands of years. We've traced the expansion of bottleneck survivors across the globe and their encounters with other human species. We've considered the psychological dimensions of living through an extinction event, and we've reflected on what these ancient events mean for modern humanity facing its own challenges. The genetic bottleneck is more than a scientific curiosity. It's a fundamental part of human history, an event that shaped who we are biologically, behaviorally, and perhaps even psychologically. It's a reminder of our vulnerability and our resilience, a demonstration that humans can survive the worst and still build something better. It's a story of nearly ending and beginning again. It's written in our DNA, visible to anyone who knows how to read the genetic code, an indelible mark left by our species' darkest moment. And it's a story that belongs to everyone. Whether you're listening to this in Lagos or London, Beijing or Buenos Aires, you're part of this narrative. Your ancestors survived. They passed down genes that eventually led to you. You're carrying forward a legacy 70,000 years old, a lineage that refused to die even when death seemed inevitable. That's worth honoring, worth remembering, worth living up to. The bottleneck survivors didn't have advanced technology or scientific understanding. They didn't know what was happening or why. They just knew they had to keep going. They had to take care of each other. They had to cooperate and innovate and refuse to give up. And because they did, we're here. All 8 billion of us, scattered across the planet, living lives they could never have imagined, but carrying their genes, their legacy, their determination. So thank you, ancient ancestors. Thank you for surviving when survival seemed impossible. Thank you for holding on through volcanic winter and starvation and loss. Thank you for cooperating when competition might have been easier. Thank you for caring for your children enough to keep them alive through the worst conditions imaginable. Thank you for refusing to give up. We're here because you didn't quit, and that's a debt we can never fully repay, but we can honor it. We can remember it. We can try to live up to it. We can face our own challenges with the same resilience and determination that carried our ancestors through the bottleneck. We can cooperate the way they did, work together to solve problems, help each other through difficulties. We can remember that we're all family, all descendants of the same survivors, all carrying the same genetic heritage. And maybe that can make a difference. Maybe remembering our shared ancestry can help us treat each other with more compassion, work together more effectively, face the future with more hope. The genetic bottleneck that nearly ended humanity 70,000 years ago didn't destroy us. It tested us. It shaped us. It made us into the species we are today. Resilient, cooperative, adaptive, determined. We're survivors' descendants. And that means something. It means we've got what it takes. It means we've faced worse. It means we can handle what comes next if we remember the lessons of our ancestors and apply them to our own time. Good night, and thanks for being part of this family of survivors. You're carrying forward a lineage 70,000 years old, and it's been an honor to tell you its story. But wait, there's more to this story that we need to explore. Because the genetic bottleneck didn't affect all populations equally. The survivors weren't randomly distributed. They were concentrated in specific regions, specific environments that offered better chances of survival. And understanding where these refugia were, where humanity held on during the darkest times, tells us something important about human adaptability and the geography of survival. When researchers analyze modern genetic diversity, they find the highest levels in Africa, specifically in East Africa and Southern Africa. This isn't surprising. Africa is where modern humans evolved. But what's interesting is the pattern within Africa. Some regions show higher diversity than others. Some populations have genetic signatures, suggesting they remained relatively stable through the bottleneck. Others show evidence of severe population contraction, followed by expansion. The populations with the most genetic diversity, groups like the San people of southern Africa, or various East African populations, likely represent lineages that survived in refugia. These are areas where conditions remained tolerable during the volcanic winter, where food sources persisted, where humans could maintain viable populations. The San, sometimes called Bushmen, though many consider that term outdated, have been shown through genetic analysis to be one of the oldest continuous populations on Earth. Their genetic lineage splits off from other human lineages very early, and they've maintained relatively high genetic diversity compared to other populations. This suggests that southern Africa was a key refugium during the bottleneck. The climate there, while affected by global cooling, might have remained more stable than elsewhere. The biodiversity, even during crisis conditions, might have provided enough resources to sustain small populations. And the San ancestors, with their sophisticated knowledge of desert and savanna environments, might have been particularly well adapted to survive harsh conditions. East Africa is another likely refugium. The Rift Valley, with its lakes and diverse ecosystems, might have buffered against the worst climate effects. Even during periods of global cooling, equatorial regions maintain relatively stable temperatures. And East Africa has been a center of human evolution for millions of years. If any place on Earth could sustain human populations through a climate catastrophe, the regions where we evolved would be good candidates. Some researchers have suggested that coastal regions also served as refugia. Coastlines during the Ice Age were different from today. Sea levels were lower, exposing continental shelves that are now underwater. These coastal plains might have provided rich resources: shellfish, fish, seabirds, marine mammals. And coastal environments are relatively buffered against temperature extremes. The ocean moderates climate, preventing the most extreme temperature swings that occur inland. There's genetic evidence supporting coastal refugia. Populations in southern Asia, particularly in India and Southeast Asia, show genetic signatures consistent with long-term stability. These might represent populations that survived along ancient coastlines, exploiting marine resources when terrestrial resources failed. The same might be true for populations in southern Arabia, around the Red Sea, or along the East African coast. Imagine these refugia as islands of survival in a world gone hostile. Small populations, maybe hundreds or thousands of individuals, clustered in favorable locations, separated from each other by hundreds or thousands of miles of territory that had become uninhabitable. No contact between groups, or only occasional contact when brave individuals made dangerous journeys between refugia. Each population isolated, developing slightly different cultures, slightly different genetic profiles, but all facing the same challenge: survive until conditions improve. This isolation would have important evolutionary consequences. In population genetics, there's a concept called the founder effect. When a population splits and a small group colonizes a new area, that group carries only a subset of the genetic diversity from the parent population. The new population's genetics are determined by whichever individuals happened to be in the founder group. If those founders had unusual genetic traits, those traits become common in the new population, even if they're rare in the parent population. The bottleneck created multiple founder effects. Each refugium population was, in effect, a founder population. The genetic makeup of survivors in southern Africa might have been slightly different from survivors in East Africa or Southern Asia. Random differences, not necessarily adaptive, just chance variations in which individuals happened to survive. When these populations eventually expanded and reconnected, they brought their slightly different genetic profiles with them. This is part of why modern populations show regional genetic variation, even though the overall level of human genetic diversity is low. The archaeological record from the bottleneck period is frustratingly sparse, but what exists is consistent with the refugia hypothesis. Before the Toba eruption, around 80,000 years ago, we see evidence of human occupation across much of Africa and into the Middle East. Archaeological sites show stone tools, evidence of hunting, signs of complex behavior. Then, around 75,000 to 70,000 years ago, there's a gap. Many sites show abandonment or reduced occupation. The density of artifacts decreases. The geographic range of human sites contracts. Some regions show continuous occupation through this period, though usually with signs of population stress. Shell middens along the South African coast continue, suggesting coastal populations survived by exploiting marine resources. Some sites in East Africa show occupation, though often with simpler tool assemblages, suggesting populations were focused on immediate survival rather than innovation. A few sites in India show continued occupation, though again with evidence of reduced population density. Then, after about 65,000 to 60,000 years ago, the archaeological record explodes. Sites become more numerous. Tool assemblages become more sophisticated. We see the first clear evidence of symbolic behavior, art, jewelry, elaborate grave goods. Trade networks appear, with materials moving hundreds of miles from their sources. The geographic range of human occupation expands dramatically. Within a few thousand years, humans had moved beyond Africa into Asia, eventually reaching Australia, Europe, and everywhere else. This archaeological pattern matches the genetic evidence perfectly. Severe bottleneck around 75,000 to 70,000 years ago, with populations surviving in limited refugia. Then rapid expansion, starting around 65,000 to 60,000 years ago, as climate improved and populations rebounded. The survivors emerged from their refugia and spread out, recolonizing territory that had been abandoned, expanding into new territories that had never been occupied, and bringing with them new technologies and behaviors that would define modern human culture. One of the most striking features of this post-bottleneck expansion is how fast it was. The speed of human colonization of the globe is unprecedented in the history of large mammal species. Most species expand their ranges gradually over hundreds of thousands or millions of years, limited by their ability to adapt to new environments. But post-bottleneck humans moved from Africa to Australia in maybe 15,000 years, from Africa to Europe in maybe 20,000 years, from Africa to the Americas, crossing an entire hemisphere in maybe 50,000 years. This suggests that something about post-bottleneck humans was different. We weren't just slightly better at adapting, we were dramatically better. And this relates to one of the most important questions about the bottleneck. Did it cause the cognitive revolution? Did the near-extinction event somehow trigger the emergence of modern human cognition and culture? The timing is suggestive. Before the bottleneck, anatomically modern humans existed for more than 100,000 years, but their behavior wasn't clearly different from other human species. They made stone tools, yes, but so did Neanderthals. They hunted, but so did Homo erectus. They lived in groups, but social behavior is common among primates. Nothing about pre-bottleneck humans screamed, "We're going to dominate the planet." They were smart, sure, but not obviously smarter than Neanderthals or Denisovans. After the bottleneck, everything changed. Suddenly, we see art, clearly symbolic art, not ambiguous markings that might be decorative. Jewelry and personal adornment, showing self-awareness and social signaling. Sophisticated composite tools, weapons made from multiple materials assembled in specific ways, showing planning and technical knowledge. Long-distance trade networks, proving that groups maintained relationships across hundreds of miles. Elaborate burials with grave goods, indicating belief in an afterlife, or at least complex social rituals. These aren't just quantitative changes. These are qualitative differences. These are behaviors that require abstract thinking, symbolic reasoning, complex language, long-term planning. These are uniquely modern human behaviors, and they appear in the archaeological record right after the bottleneck, between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago. So what happened? Did the bottleneck cause a genetic change that enhanced cognitive abilities? Did the harsh selective pressure favor groups with better communication, more sophisticated social structures, enhanced innovation capacity? That's possible. In a small population under extreme stress, evolution can happen rapidly. Beneficial traits that improve survival spread quickly. And cognitive abilities, the ability to innovate, to cooperate, to plan ahead, these would have been crucial for survival during the bottleneck. Some researchers have proposed that language, specifically complex grammatical language, emerged during the bottleneck period. The argument goes like this. Language requires specialized neural architecture. It requires specific genetic changes affecting brain development. In a large population, such changes would spread slowly. But in a small population, especially one under intense selective pressure, changes that improved communication would have enormous survival advantages. Groups with better language could coordinate hunting more effectively, share knowledge more efficiently, plan more carefully. They would outsurvive groups with less sophisticated language. If a mutation-enhancing language abilities arose in the bottleneck population, it could have spread through the entire population in just a few thousand years. And when the population expanded, everyone would carry it. All modern humans would have this enhanced language capacity, which is exactly what we see. All human populations have full grammatical language. All can learn any language if exposed in childhood. All show the same basic cognitive capacities for symbolic thinking, abstract reasoning, and complex communication. This is the strong version of the hypothesis. The bottleneck caused genetic changes that enhanced cognition, but there's a weaker version that doesn't require genetic changes at all. Maybe the cognitive abilities were always there, latent in the human brain, but not fully expressed until circumstances forced their use. During the bottleneck, when survival became incredibly difficult, groups that could innovate, that could develop new technologies, that could organize more effectively, those groups survived. The bottleneck didn't create new cognitive abilities. It selected for populations that were already using those abilities most effectively. Think of it like a stress test. The abilities were there all along, but they weren't necessary before the bottleneck. Pre-bottleneck humans could survive with relatively simple technology and social organization. But during the bottleneck, only the most cognitively advanced groups made it through. The bottleneck filtered human populations, eliminating those who couldn't adapt and preserving those who could. After the bottleneck, all surviving humans descended from these cognitively advanced groups. This second explanation doesn't require genetic changes, just cultural selection. But the effect is the same. After the bottleneck, all humans exhibited modern cognitive behaviors because only groups with those behaviors survived. Whether the bottleneck caused genetic evolution, cultural evolution, or some combination, the result was a species transformed. There's yet another possibility. Maybe the cognitive revolution had nothing to do with the bottleneck directly, but was enabled by the population structure it created. Small, isolated populations develop their own cultures, their own innovations. Most of these innovations are lost because small populations are vulnerable to extinction. But occasionally, a small population develops something really useful. A new tool type, a new social practice, a new symbolic system. If that population survives and expands, their innovation spreads. The bottleneck created exactly these conditions. Multiple small populations, isolated in different refugia, independently innovating. Most innovations were lost when populations died out. But some innovations persisted, and when populations re-expanded and reconnected, innovations spread through contact. The result would be a rapid accumulation of cultural innovations, a cognitive explosion, not because individuals got smarter, but because population structure favored innovation and diffusion. We may never know which explanation is correct. Maybe all three played a role. Genetic changes enhancing cognition, cultural selection favoring advanced behaviors, and population structure enabling innovation diffusion. What's clear is that post-bottleneck humans were different from pre-bottleneck humans in important ways. Not anatomically, our bodies hadn't changed, but behaviorally, culturally, cognitively, we had become fully and undeniably modern humans. Let's think about what the world looked like after the bottleneck, as survivors emerged from refugia and began expanding. Climate was improving. The volcanic winter had ended. Temperatures were rising. Ice sheets were retreating. Ecosystems were recovering. Plant and animal populations were rebounding. The world was becoming more hospitable again, and humans were ready to exploit it. The first expansion was probably within Africa itself. Populations that had been confined to small refugia began spreading out, recolonizing territory that had been abandoned during the crisis. They followed rivers, hunted expanding game populations, gathered recovering plant resources. They reconnected with other survivor groups, exchanging genes, technologies, and cultural practices. Within a few thousand years, humans were once again spread across much of Africa. But some groups didn't stop at Africa's borders. Around 65,000 to 70,000 years ago, a group of humans left Africa, crossing into the Middle East. This wasn't the first time humans had left Africa. There's evidence of earlier exits, possibly as far back as 100,000 years ago. But those earlier attempts either failed or left no genetic trace in modern populations. The expansion around 65,000 years ago was different. This one stuck. This one led to the permanent human colonization of the entire planet. The route was probably along the southern coast of Arabia. During the Ice Age, sea levels were lower, exposing coastal plains that are now underwater. These plains would have provided a continuous corridor from Africa into Asia, with marine resources all along the way. The migrants followed the coast, moving east, generation by generation, establishing themselves in new territories. These weren't explorers in the modern sense. They weren't deliberately trying to discover new lands. They were just expanding into available territory, following food sources, looking for good places to settle. But the cumulative effect over generations was a migration covering thousands of miles. By 60,000 years ago, humans had reached South Asia. By 50,000 years ago, maybe earlier, they'd reached Southeast Asia and Australia. Reaching Australia required crossing water barriers. Even with lower ice age sea levels, there were always stretches of open water between Southeast Asia and Australia. This means these early humans had boats or rafts capable of crossing dozens of miles of ocean. We have no physical evidence of these watercraft. Wood doesn't preserve for 50,000 years. But the fact of human presence in Australia is itself evidence that they existed. Think about what it took to cross those water barriers. First, you need boats. That means understanding principles of buoyancy, selecting appropriate materials, constructing vessels that won't sink or break apart in waves. Second, you need navigation. You can't see Australia from Southeast Asia. The distances are too great, so either these crossings were accidental, people getting caught in storms and blown off course, or they were deliberate, meaning humans had some way to know there was land beyond the horizon and some way to navigate toward it. The fact that humans reached Australia by 50,000 years ago, possibly as early as 65,000 years ago, suggests these weren't just lucky accidents. Multiple crossings must have occurred, bringing enough people to establish viable populations. This implies a level of maritime technology and navigation ability that we don't have direct archaeological evidence for. But it must have existed. The humans are there. They got there somehow, and that somehow involved sophisticated seafaring. Once in Australia, these populations became isolated. For the next 50,000 years, until European contact in recent centuries, Aboriginal Australians developed largely independently from populations in Africa, Europe, and Asia. They adapted to Australian environments, developing technologies and cultural practices suited to local conditions. They maintained oral traditions, sophisticated knowledge systems about their environment, complex social organizations, and rich artistic traditions. They proved that humans could thrive in isolation, that we didn't need constant contact with other populations to maintain cultural sophistication. Meanwhile, back in Asia, other populations were expanding north and west. Some moved into Central Asia, eventually reaching Siberia. Others moved into Europe, encountering Neanderthals, and eventually replacing or absorbing them. These northern expansions required adapting to colder climates than humans had experienced before. We're a tropical species by origin, evolved in Africa's warm climates. Moving into Ice Age, Europe, or Siberia required new technologies, and post-bottleneck humans delivered. They developed fitted clothing, sewn from animal skins, to protect against cold. They built substantial shelters, not just temporary camps, but semi-permanent structures that could withstand harsh winters. They developed new hunting technologies specialized for cold-adapted prey, like reindeer, mammoths, and bison. They learned to exploit seasonally abundant resources, preserving food for winter, planning months in advance. These weren't minor adjustments. These were major cultural innovations, enabling survival in environments no human had successfully colonized before. The speed of adaptation is remarkable. In Europe, the earliest modern human sites date to about 45,000 years ago. Within 10,000 years, humans had colonized all of Europe, from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle, from the Atlantic to the Urals. They'd developed regional cultures adapted to local conditions. They'd created some of the most spectacular prehistoric art we know, the cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira. They'd developed sophisticated toolkits with dozens of specialized tools for different tasks. They'd established long-distance trade networks, moving materials hundreds of miles from their sources. This is 15,000 years after the bottleneck. 15,000 years. In evolutionary terms, that's nothing. That's not enough time for significant genetic adaptation to new environments. Yet humans went from barely surviving in African refugia to thriving in Ice Age Europe. How? Through culture, through innovation, through the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next, through the ability to learn, to adapt behaviorally rather than genetically, to solve problems with technology rather than biology. This is the real legacy of the bottleneck. Not just that we survived, but how we survived. By being the species that could change its behavior faster than other species could evolve. By being the species that could adapt culturally, that could innovate, that could transmit learned knowledge rather than just instinctive behaviors. The bottleneck tested this capacity to its limits, and we passed the test. We survived not by being stronger or faster than other species, but by being smarter, more flexible, more cooperative. By 40,000 years ago, modern humans had spread across Africa, Asia, and Europe. We were in the process of colonizing Australia, and we were about to make the jump to the Americas, the last uninhabited continent. The bottleneck that almost ended humanity had instead launched us on a trajectory toward global dominance. From a few thousand survivors to a species present on every continent, in every environment, from deserts to rainforests to tundra, all in the span of 30,000 years. All because we could adapt faster than the world could change. The expansion into the Americas is particularly interesting because it happened relatively late, and we can trace it in considerable detail. During the Ice Age, the Bering Strait between Siberia and Alaska was a land bridge. Sea levels were low enough that you could walk from Asia to North America without crossing water. Humans in Siberia, following game animals, eventually crossed this bridge, probably around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, though the dates are debated, and some evidence suggests possibly earlier crossings. Once in Alaska, these populations faced a challenge. Most of North America was covered by massive ice sheets. The Laurentide ice sheet covered the east. The Cordilleran ice sheet covered the mountain ranges along the west coast. Between them was a narrow, ice-free corridor. But whether this corridor was open and passable during the initial human arrival is uncertain. An alternative route was along the Pacific coast, following the shoreline south around the ice sheets. This would have required boats, but we know humans had boats by this time. By 15,000 years ago, humans were definitely in the Americas. By 13,000 years ago, they'd reached the southern tip of South America. That's the entire length of 2 continents in maybe 2,000 years. That's moving fast, averaging a kilometre per year of southward progress. Though, again, the actual pattern was probably more complex, with rapid expansion phases and settlement phases. What's remarkable is what happened next. When humans arrived in the Americas, they found a megafauna paradise. Giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, mammoths, mastodons, giant beavers, giant armadillos, horses, camels, massive bison. The Americas were full of large mammals, many of which had never encountered human hunters, and weren't adapted to avoid human predation. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, most of these species were extinct. Now, there's debate about whether humans caused these extinctions or whether climate change was the primary factor. The end of the Ice Age brought major environmental changes that might have stressed megafauna populations. But the timing is suspicious. The extinctions cluster around the time of human arrival in different regions. And there's evidence of human hunting of these species. Spear points found with mammoth bones, kill sites showing butchery. The most likely explanation is that humans were a significant factor, probably in combination with climate stress. But whatever the cause, the result was dramatic. The Americas lost most of their large mammal species in just a few thousand years. This is important because it shows how powerful humans had become. We weren't just another species trying to fit into existing ecosystems. We were ecosystem engineers, capable of causing extinctions, of fundamentally reshaping the environments we entered. This power, this capacity to alter nature, is another legacy of the bottleneck. The survivors and their descendants developed technologies and hunting strategies that made them the most effective predators on Earth. And when they entered new continents with naive prey, the results were catastrophic for those prey species. By 10,000 years ago, humans had reached every continent except Antarctica. We'd spread from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from tropical forests to deserts to tundra. We'd adapted to every environment Earth could throw at us. And we'd done it all in the 60,000 years since the bottleneck. That's 60,000 years from near extinction to global dominance. That's 2,500 generations. In evolutionary terms, that's instantaneous. And the colonization of the globe was just the beginning. The next phase of human history, the development of agriculture and civilization, was about to begin. And it too can be traced back to the bottleneck and its aftermath. Because the population expansions that followed the bottleneck eventually filled all available land with hunter-gatherers. By 10,000 years ago, there wasn't much empty territory left. Population densities were increasing, competition for resources was intensifying, and this pressure would push some populations to develop a completely new way of living, agriculture. But that's a story for another time. For now, the key point is this. The genetic bottleneck that nearly destroyed humanity 70,000 years ago set in motion a chain of events that led to human dominance of the planet. The survivors, emerging from their refugia, carried with them not just genes, but cultures, technologies, and cognitive abilities that enabled unprecedented adaptation. They spread across the globe faster than any large mammal species had ever expanded before. They colonized every environment, overcame every obstacle, outlasted every competitor, and they did it through innovation, cooperation, and the transmission of knowledge. These are the gifts of the bottleneck. This is our inheritance from the survivors, and it's why we're here today, 8 billion descendants of a few thousand people who refused to give up when the world was ending. If you've stayed with me this far, if these ideas have captured your imagination or helped you relax into sleep, I want you to remember one final thing. The story of the genetic bottleneck isn't just history, it's identity. It's who we are as a species. We're the descendants of survivors. We're products of the worst disaster in human history. We're carrying genetic scars that mark us as a species that came close to extinction. But we're also carrying the legacy of resilience, of cooperation, of innovation that pulled us through. That legacy is still with us. It's still shaping human behavior, human culture, human responses to challenges. When modern humans face catastrophes, when we encounter new problems, when we need to adapt to changing circumstances, we draw on capacities developed during and after the bottleneck. Our ability to innovate quickly, our capacity for cooperation, our talent for transmitting knowledge culturally rather than genetically. These aren't accidents, they're adaptations. They're the survival mechanisms that got us through the bottleneck and its aftermath. And they're still working today, still enabling humans to thrive in a changing world. So as you drift towards sleep, as these ideas settle into your consciousness, remember that you're part of this story. You're not just learning about the bottleneck, you're a product of it. Your existence is proof that the survivors held on. Your DNA is evidence of their ordeal. Your life is their legacy. And maybe that's something to carry forward, something to remember when things get difficult. You're descended from people who survived the worst. You've got what it takes, because they did. And that's written into every cell of your body, into the very structure of your genes. Sweet dreams, descendants of survivors. The bottleneck is behind us. The future is ahead. And we're still here, still thriving, still carrying forward the legacy of that tiny population that refused to die when the world went dark and cold. That's who we are. That's what the genetic bottleneck reveals. And that's a story worth remembering as you sleep. Before we close, there's one more dimension to explore: the medical and biological implications of the bottleneck. Because our reduced genetic diversity isn't just an interesting historical fact. It affects our health, our susceptibility to diseases, our response to medications. It shapes medical research and public health in ways that aren't always obvious but are deeply important. Remember, the bottleneck reduced human genetic diversity to levels lower than most other species. This has consequences. In medicine, we see patterns that make sense only when you understand the bottleneck. For example, certain genetic diseases are surprisingly common in humans compared to what you'd expect in a genetically diverse species. Sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs disease. These are caused by recessive mutations. In a genetically diverse population, harmful recessive mutations are usually rare because they're constantly being diluted by incoming genetic variation. But in a population that went through a bottleneck, harmful mutations present in the founder population can become relatively common. This is why genetic counseling and screening are so important in human medicine. Our low genetic diversity means that if you and your partner are from the same ethnic background, there's a higher chance you're carrying copies of the same harmful recessive mutations. It's not that humans are particularly prone to genetic diseases. It's that our bottleneck reduced diversity enough that harmful mutations didn't get diluted the way they would in a more diverse species. The bottleneck also affects how we respond to diseases. Take infectious diseases. When a new pathogen emerges, our low genetic diversity means most humans are similarly vulnerable. We don't have the immune system variation that would provide natural resistance in some individuals. This is why pandemics can spread so effectively through human populations. A virus or bacterium that can infect one person can usually infect most people because we're all so genetically similar. This has been true throughout history. The Black Death in the 14th century killed a third of Europe's population. Smallpox devastated Native Americans who had no prior exposure. the 1918 influenza pandemic killed tens of millions worldwide. And more recently, COVID-19 spread globally in a matter of months, affecting nearly every country. Part of the reason these diseases can spread so effectively is our low genetic diversity. In a more diverse species, natural resistance would be more common, and diseases would have a harder time becoming pandemic. On the flip side, this same low diversity is why vaccines work so well in humans. When researchers develop a vaccine, it usually works for almost everyone because we're all so similar genetically. Our immune systems respond similarly to the same antigens. This makes vaccine development more straightforward for humans than it would be for a more genetically diverse species. So, the bottleneck cut both ways. It made us more vulnerable to pandemics, but also made us more responsive to medical interventions like vaccines. The bottleneck also affects pharmacology, the study of how drugs work in the body. Different people respond differently to medications, partly because of genetic variations in how drugs are metabolized. But the range of variation in humans is relatively narrow compared to other species. Most medications work similarly for most people. This is another consequence of low genetic diversity. It makes drug development more efficient because drugs tested in one population are likely to work in others. But it also means that if a drug has serious side effects for genetic reasons, those side effects are likely to affect many people, not just a few unfortunate individuals. Modern genomic medicine is revealing more about how the bottleneck affects health. As we sequence more human genomes, we're finding that certain regions of the genome show very low variation. These are regions where the bottleneck eliminated almost all diversity, leaving just one or two variant types. Interestingly, these low diversity regions often include genes related to brain function, immune response, and reproduction. These are exactly the systems you'd expect to be under strong selective pressure during a survival crisis. The bottleneck didn't just reduce diversity randomly, it shaped which variants survived based on what was needed to get through the catastrophe. Some researchers have suggested that certain modern diseases might be connected to the bottleneck. Autoimmune diseases, where the immune system attacks the body's own tissues, might be partly due to the loss of immune system diversity during the bottleneck. In a more diverse population, there would be more variation in immune genes, potentially reducing the frequency of autoimmune conditions. Mental health conditions might also be affected. Our brains, shaped by selection during the bottleneck, might be optimized for the small group social environments our ancestors survived in, not the large complex societies we live in today. This is speculative, and it's important not to overstate these connections. Most diseases have complex causes involving multiple genes, environmental factors, and chance. The bottleneck is just one factor among many, but it's a factor worth considering, especially as we develop new medical treatments and public health strategies. Understanding that we're a species with unusually low genetic diversity helps explain certain patterns in human health and disease. There's also an evolutionary medicine perspective on the bottleneck. Our bodies are adapted for the environments our ancestors lived in during and after the bottleneck. Small hunter-gatherer groups, mobile lifestyles, diets based on wild foods, physical activity patterns very different from modern sedentary life. Many modern health problems, obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, might be partly due to mismatches between our bottleneck-era adaptations and modern environments. Our metabolism, for example, is adapted for conditions where food was sometimes scarce. The ability to store fat efficiently was beneficial during the bottleneck when starvation was a real threat. But in modern environments with abundant food, that same adaptation leads to obesity and related health problems. Our stress response systems are adapted for immediate physical threats, fight or flight, but modern stresses are chronic and psychological, not acute and physical. Our stress responses, still calibrated for bottleneck conditions, can become maladaptive in modern contexts. This isn't to say we should try to recreate bottleneck-era lifestyles. That's neither possible nor desirable. But understanding the evolutionary context helps us make better health choices. We can recognize that our bodies and minds are adapted for conditions different from those we live in now. We can design environments, diets, and lifestyles that better match our evolved biology. We can use medical interventions to compensate for mismatches between our biology and our environment. The bottleneck also has implications for human evolution going forward. With such low genetic diversity, are we still evolving? Are we capable of adapting genetically to future challenges? The answer is complicated. On one hand, natural selection has largely stopped operating on humans, at least in developed countries. We've created environments where almost everyone survives to reproductive age. We have medicine that overcomes genetic disadvantages. We have technology that compensates for physical limitations. The strong selective pressures that drove evolution during the bottleneck are largely absent. On the other hand, humans are still accumulating mutations. Every generation, new genetic variants appear. Some are neutral, some slightly harmful, a few potentially beneficial. Over time, these mutations increase genetic diversity, slowly rebuilding variation lost during the bottleneck. But this process is slow. It takes many thousands of generations to significantly increase diversity through new mutations alone. We've had only about 2,500 generations since the bottleneck. That's not enough time to rebuild the diversity we lost. There's also ongoing gene flow between populations. As human populations that were isolated for thousands of years now interbreed more frequently, genetic variation is being redistributed. Someone with ancestors from Europe, Africa, and Asia carries a combination of genetic variants that wouldn't have existed before these populations reconnected. This mixing doesn't create new variants, but it does create new combinations, which can be important for adaptation. Some researchers have identified recent genetic changes in human populations, evidence of evolution happening in the last few thousand years. Lactose tolerance in adults, common in European and some African populations, but rare elsewhere, evolved in the last 10,000 years in populations that kept dairy animals. High-altitude adaptation in Tibetan populations, genetic variants that help cope with low oxygen levels, evolved in the last few thousand years. These are real examples of recent human evolution, proof that we're still capable of genetic adaptation, but the pace of genetic evolution is slow compared to the pace of cultural and technological change. We're adapting to modern life much faster through culture than through biology. We invented agriculture and then adjusted our cultures to agricultural life, rather than waiting for genetic adaptations. We developed technologies to live in hostile environments, rather than evolving biological adaptations to those environments. We created medicines to overcome diseases, rather than evolving genetic resistance. This is the pattern established after the bottleneck. Cultural evolution is our primary adaptation mechanism now. Genetic evolution still happens, but it's secondary, slower, less important to our survival and success. Looking to the future, this pattern will probably continue. We'll face new challenges, climate change, emerging diseases, technological disruptions, and will respond primarily through culture and technology, not genetic evolution. This is both reassuring and concerning. Reassuring because cultural adaptation is fast. We can solve problems in years or decades, rather than waiting thousands of generations for genetic solutions. Concerning because cultural adaptation is fragile. Knowledge can be lost. Technologies can fail. Societies can collapse. Genetic adaptations, once established, are permanent. Cultural adaptations require constant maintenance. The bottleneck taught us that we're a resilient species. We survived near extinction through innovation, cooperation, and cultural transmission of knowledge. These same capacities will help us face future challenges. But we should also remember that the bottleneck was a catastrophe. It almost destroyed us. And we still carry the scars in our reduced genetic diversity, in our vulnerability to pandemics, in our adaptations to environments that no longer exist. We're survivors, yes, but we're vulnerable survivors. Our dominance of the planet shouldn't make us complacent. We've been close to the edge before. We could get close again. There's a certain humility that comes from understanding the bottleneck. We're not the inevitable result of evolution, the species destined to rule the Earth. We're the lucky survivors of a near-extinction event. We could easily have gone extinct 70,000 years ago. If the Toba eruption had been slightly larger, if the volcanic winter had lasted slightly longer, if the survivors had been slightly less fortunate, we wouldn't be here. Some other species would have inherited the Earth, or maybe no species would have achieved our level of intelligence and cultural complexity. The fact that we exist is contingent, dependent on specific historical circumstances that could have gone differently. This perspective is important as we face global challenges today: climate change, nuclear weapons, biotechnology, artificial intelligence. These are challenges that could potentially threaten human survival. Not in the same way the bottleneck did. We're much more numerous and widespread now. But we're still vulnerable. Our civilization is complex and interdependent. Disrupting key systems could have cascading effects. And our low genetic diversity means we're all vulnerable in similar ways. A catastrophe that affects some of us could affect all of us. The lesson from the bottleneck isn't that humans always survive. It's that survival is possible if we cooperate, if we innovate, if we maintain the knowledge and social structures that enable adaptation. The survivors of the bottleneck weren't passive victims who just got lucky. They were active agents who made choices, who worked together, who used their intelligence and creativity to overcome challenges. That's what saved us then. That's what could save us now. So, as we come to the end of this long journey through the genetic bottleneck, through 70,000 years of human history, through the catastrophe that almost ended our species, and the recovery that made us dominant, what should we take away? Perhaps just this: we're all connected, all family, all descendants of the same small group of survivors. We're all carrying the same genetic legacy, the same scars from the bottleneck, the same capacities that enabled survival. We're all beneficiaries of our ancestors' resilience and all inheritors of their vulnerabilities. The genetic bottleneck is written into our DNA, but its meaning is written into our choices. Will we cooperate the way our ancestors did? Will we use our cognitive abilities to solve problems rather than create them? Will we preserve the knowledge and social structures that enable adaptation? Will we remember that we're one species, one family, all in this together? These are the questions the bottleneck poses to us. These are the challenges we face as descendants of survivors. And maybe, as you drift off to sleep, as these ideas settle into your mind, you can carry forward a sense of connection to your ancestors who survived the bottleneck, to all the other humans alive today, all carrying the same genetic heritage, to future generations who will inherit whatever world we create. The bottleneck connects us all, backward through time to our origins, forward through time to our potential futures. We're links in a chain 70,000 years long, connecting the few thousand who survived to the billions alive today, to the unknown numbers who will live tomorrow. That chain is unbroken because our ancestors refused to give up, because they cooperated, because they innovated, because they cared enough about their children to keep them alive through the worst conditions imaginable. We owe them our existence, and we owe future generations our best efforts to preserve what we've inherited and build something better. So thank you for joining me on this journey through the genetic bottleneck. Thank you for caring about where we came from, about what shaped us, about what our genes reveal about our history. If you've enjoyed this exploration, if it's helped you relax or given you something to think about, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries. And leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. What part of the world are you in right now? What's the time? Are you in bed, ready to sleep, or somewhere else entirely? I read every comment, and I love seeing the global community of people fascinated by these ancient stories. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, remember that you're part of this story. You're a living descendant of bottleneck survivors. You're carrying their DNA, their legacy, their determination. That's not just interesting history, that's identity. That's who you are at the most fundamental biological level. And maybe that's worth remembering when things get tough, when challenges seem insurmountable, when the future looks uncertain. You're descended from people who survived the worst catastrophe in human history. You've got their resilience in your genes. You've got their capacity for cooperation, for innovation, for refusing to give up. That's your inheritance. That's your birthright as a human being. Sleep well, descendants of survivors. Dream of volcanic winters and small populations holding on against impossible odds. Dream of the moment when everything could have ended but didn't. Dream of your ancestors, whoever they were, wherever they were, keeping you alive through the darkness so you could be here now, thousands of generations later, part of a species that refused to die. The genetic bottleneck that nearly destroyed humanity 70,000 years ago is ancient history now. The Toba eruption is long past. The volcanic winter has ended. The survivors have been gone for millennia. But their legacy lives on, in every cell of your body, in the structure of your DNA, in the genetic diversity we lack, and the resilience we possess. We're all carrying forward their story. We're all proof that they succeeded. We're all testament to the fact that humans can survive anything if we work together, if we innovate, if we refuse to give up. That's the final lesson of the genetic bottleneck. Not that catastrophe is inevitable, not that we're doomed to repeat the near extinction of our ancestors, But that survival is possible, that humans are resilient, that cooperation works, that innovation matters, that refusing to give up, even when the sky is dark and the world is cold and everyone around you is dying, that refusal to surrender is what separates extinction from survival. Our ancestors made that choice 70,000 years ago. They chose to keep going, and because they did, we're here. So, as you close your eyes and let sleep take you, carry that knowledge with you. You're part of an unbroken lineage stretching back through the worst disaster in human history. You're a survivor's descendant. You've got what it takes because they did. And that's written into your genes, into your history, into your very existence. Good night, sweet dreams, and thank you for being part of this ancient family of survivors. The bottleneck is 70,000 years behind us, but its lessons are eternal, and its legacy lives on in every human alive today, including you. Sleep well,